as many people know today, our national defense strategy addresses major competitors that our nation faces. What we haven't figured out yet is what's the impact on both the industry and the government in terms of how we've been doing things and how we should be doing things to address now major competitors that face this nation. It's a very complex issue, but there's one very simple answer that most people are just starting to understand. The only way to, one, understand the problem, understand the impacts of these major competitors, is that we have got to collaborate. We've got to work together across industry, across government, across academic institutions. Everyone in this nation who has something to offer to the discussion needs to come to the fight, needs to come to the table to define the problem, define the requirements, and then, most importantly, work together to find the solutions to protect the national security of this country. And when you look at this society, the Society of American Military Engineers, that's why we exist. The national security of this country is all about the collaboration between all of us who have the capability to ensure that this nation remains secure forever. Not just for our kids, but our grandkids. And if I can just make one last comment, you know we're coming up on our centennial. None of us will be here for our bicentennial. But by God, the work we do today working together will ensure that this nation is here for our bicentennial. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending this session. I know this is the last day, and we're hopefully will culminate with some great insights from this panel. I'm really excited to be here. I left a snowy Denver to come to Tampa, and it's really nice to be with this community. Today we're going to talk a little bit about something that this group of folks were a part of, and many others, and it deals with this whole issue of community resilience, both from a public safety as well as from a national security vantage point. As we get started here, I just want to make some quick administrative remarks, and then we'll jump right into it. First of all, I'd ask everyone to silence their phones. I need to go over the exit procedures. If there's an emergency, we go out the back door. And this does count for some continuing credit, and we want to thank all the sponsors for the event. So we're going to spend the next hour or so talking about an event we call Jack Voltaic. We'll talk about what that is and what it means, but it really, for looking at the audience, looking at both the government, military representatives, as well as the industry representatives, as well as some academia, this is really about partnerships. This is really about ways of building relationships in different ways in light of where we are going with the threat and with technologies today. So what I'd like to do is just give you a high-level overview of what Jack Voltaic is, and then I'm going to turn to our experts on panel to describe their particular role and perspective, and then we'll have a conversation. And I'd really encourage, since we have a small group here, really encourage folks to have a conversation about Jack Voltaic. This is an event inside of a strategy. So let me go to the first slide here. So Jack Voltaic really is more than an exercise. It was an experiment and a research project that was spawned by the Army Cyber Institute, represented here by Chris Hartley. And what the Army was trying to do was to look at not just critical infrastructure, but look at ways that the Army, as it deploys and as it works in the homeland, what the urban environments are going to be like, and how they're going to need to operate in terms of achieving military missions, as well as supporting local communities. Jack Voltaic 1, Chris will talk about. This is a focus today on Jack Voltaic 2, which build upon the lessons learned. And really, this idea of critical infrastructure, the way we protect critical infrastructure, the way we respond to events that put critical infrastructure under stress, are changing. And part of that's technology, and part of that is threat. As we look at what this was about, it was really trying to look at an evolving threat of both physical and cyber activities, married up with players that normally work well at local levels, but not necessarily connected into some of the other levels, and building relationships and playbooks that allow us to really be able to think about and integrate against this type of a threat. So we're going to go through different aspects of this. I'm going to start with Chris. Chris Hartley is at West Point. He's a deputy director of the Army Cyber Institute, a think tank organization that supports the Army in looking at the future of not only warfare, but the future roles of the Army in national security. So Chris will provide some introductory remarks. We'll then go over to Jack Hanegraaff. Jack represents the local level. He's in the city of Houston, really works within the emergency management system, has a great law enforcement background, and really was a critical linchpin in this bottom-up experiment and exercise we call Jack Voltaic 2. And then at the national level, outside of the Department of Defense, organizations like the Federal Emergency Management Agency were absolutely critical. And Chad Gorman represents the national level exercise program that FEMA is leading. And the folks that were in the Region 6 in this case, were absolutely instrumental in building the bridges that allowed us to succeed and to grow with Jack Voltaic too. So let me turn to Chris first for some opening remarks, and then we'll go over to Jack and then to Chad.
Thanks, Bob. As Bob said, I'm Chris Hartley, Deputy Director at the Army Cyber Institute. Back in the late 15, early 16 timeframe, we had two researchers at Army Cyber Institute who were looking at this problem set of cyber at the city infrastructure or critical infrastructure level. The gap they saw was most of your federal exercises or government exercises went down to the region, but it didn't go down to the city. So their first thought was, what happens if we start at the bottom and we drive this requirements and exercise from the bottom up? The main reason we were there, because we are the Army Cyber Institute, is what's this Army's role going to be in to protect the nation, right? Who do we interact with? How does all of that work? Well, we have Army North whose primary mission is that. However, we didn't understand it from cyber expertise. Who do we talk to? What's involved in it? So that's where the research project is. Jack Voltaic is not an exercise. It is a research effort. We can bolt that research onto pretty much any exercise that a city has going on. And so the third intent of that group of two scientists that were looking at this was, can I build a framework? And now, Chad, forgive me for the use of the framework, because that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. But can I build a template or a framework that I can apply to any city when I start looking at cyber events in that city on the critical infrastructure? That's where it all started. We had no intentions of being where we are today. It took off like nothing we had ever seen. As we started to get into New York City on Jack Voltaic 1, it was Chief Joe Pfeiffer that got us into that exercise and allowed us to do our basic research on that. And we went in with 3 or 4 objectives, and it was all looking at what does this look like at the city level? What capabilities do they have? What manpower do they have? What vulnerabilities do they have? You take that, and then we finished it up. We wrote a report. All of our reports are unclassified, open to the public, right? We go into these things knowing we're going to write about it and we're going to sit on stage and talk about it. We had a really good, successful run in New York City. If you fast forward about 18 more months, we find ourselves in Houston with Jack and his folks. And Houston had just gone through the hurricane about a year earlier, Jack? Was it about a year before we got there, right?
No, it was right in the middle. I mean, before you got there, it was several months.
Yeah, months before.
So 2 weeks before we started.
Jack and his folks in Houston said, hey, what if we have a natural disaster and a cyber event at the same time? How do we handle that? The mayor of Houston said, we don't know, let's find out. And so when we went into Houston, we went in looking at, okay, we're going to have a natural disaster occur. Obviously, a hurricane had just happened there, so that's an easy one to template out. And then we're going to add some cyber injects in there that are real to the infrastructure that's there, and let the people work through it from the EOC. In the Houston exercise, we went 2 steps further than we did in New York City. The first thing we added was what we call a live fire range. So you have on the first floor all of the players, and I know I'm almost at my 3 minutes, but I'm almost done. On the first floor, we had operators both from the city, the critical infrastructure sectors, and from the Port of Beaumont playing on computers just as if it were their own systems. And we had that game going on. As they were getting injects and doing things, it was feeding up to the EOC where Jack and his folks ran the last 2 major events out of, and it was giving them injects to make them make decisions and stuff. That's the first piece we added, is that live fire. The second piece we added was, after Jack Voltaic 1, we said we got to get the lawyers involved, right? And everybody is hesitant to do that. But so what we did for Jack Voltaic 2 is we put together a tabletop exercise for all the attorneys involved. It was an open invite. And we ran through the exercise measles and the template, and we said, at this point, we're going to do this. You can't do that. You don't have the authority. Okay, who has it? What laws and policies and what we were getting at was, what laws and policies do we need to start talking about to inject change so that we can do what we need to do? We've had FEMA, DHS, all the main players from the emergency services sector. Our private partners, the first one was Citigroup down in New York City, and AECOM in Houston. And so we're setting ourselves up for a 2-5-3-0, and I'm going to stop there because I'm talking too much.
You're doing good, Chris. Okay, so let's go over to Jack, and Jack represents kind of the local perspective. And one of the things that was unique about this exercise and experiment was the fact that it was a bottoms-up approach. I've been involved in a lot of these. Most of them have been top-down. This was an event truly that was driven from Houston up into the federal and the state level. So Jack, why don't you talk about the Houston perspective?
And it was truly a bottoms-up approach, because I am at the rock bottom. I'm probably the lowest rank in the room, and I was looking around going, oh God, I'm gonna have to do all this, because okay. So my role is Critical Infrastructure Protection Coordinator for the Houston and the 5 counties. And what that means is I work with both local governments and public and private entities to get them to understand their resilience, their vulnerabilities, their target hardening. And we also look at pushing out strategies, products, and services that we do under the Urban Area Security Initiative. Thank you, FEMA. And we're able to deliver these products to the critical infrastructure providers, both in public and private. And so up to a certain point, we were typically just dealing with physical security. We were very good at physical security. And then somewhere in there, President Obama created the directive where you have to merge the physical and the cyber together and look at that resilience and vulnerability. So we started looking at both, and so I had a very good relationship with multi-sectors. When I saw this was a multi-sector approach, bottom-up approach, I knew I was going to probably be driving a good portion of this because I had all those relationships. I could bring a lot of the people to the table. Immediately when we were approached about this, I said yes, because I was dealing with both physical and cyber. And I knew immediately, you know, there were some gaps. There was gaps extremely in communication. You know, we were very good at dealing with the physical side, with hurricanes. Everybody talks, everybody comes to the table, and tornadoes and floods. But when you start talking about cyber, crickets in the room. You know, no one's sharing anything, no one's talking anything. And we also determined that even though we're doing this, what was called a research project, that it was also going to be a lot of investigative work being done. So working as a team, we went back to my same stakeholders, and I had to revisit them again, because now I'm talking to a whole different dynamic and a whole different group in those facilities. And we discovered that the operation and the IT people didn't rarely talk unless somebody's email was out or something like that. We found that sector-wide. And then if they're not talking to each other in their own organization, they're definitely not talking to the city. So I had immediate concern when the scenario was, could the city of Houston realize that they were under a multi-sector cyber attack? And my immediate response was, no, we wouldn't realize it, because that information wasn't going to be shared. So as we're doing the preparatory work for the project, we were going to these sites and reestablishing a whole new set of relationships from a whole different group, and the same organizations always visited with, a whole new set, but we're also gathering, interacting in conversations and dialogue and starting to learn from each other and starting to learn, yes, we can establish communication. If we know what questions to ask, they will give us that answer. They won't tell us what it is going on, but if we know what certain questions to ask, when we call our utility provider and say, are you doing this or this, they will answer yes. Then if we could capture all that in a global perspective, then we would know we were under a multi-sector attack. But for them to give it to us and deliver it to us, no. We would have to physically go out and communicate with each one of those sectors.
Yep.
So the benefits for this were just overwhelming. You know, I mean, just the dynamics of bringing these people to the table that have never been brought to the table before. Like I said, we did very good on the physical side, but bringing both of those communities, if you will, together, even within their own organization, was just huge.
Thanks, Jack. So to make this work, we had to kind of build a fabric, and the fabric went from West Point and the broader Department of Defense to the local community, but then bringing in federal civil agencies. And in this case, FEMA, Region 6, played a critical role. Representing FEMA today, and really the Department of Homeland Security and our Fed Civ partners, is Chad Gorman. So Chad, you want to kind of share your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Again, my name's Chad Gorman. I'm currently the director of the National Exercise Program at FEMA's National Preparedness Directorate. My role at the agency is really to work with stakeholders and partners everywhere from the federal government all the way down to the local level to help put our plans and capabilities to the test on a variety of threats and hazards as part of our broader outreach as part of the National Preparedness System that does everything from help to support evaluation, identification of emerging threats and hazards, build both our own and our nation's and our partners' capabilities and plans to help meet those requirements and those critical issues. And then we put those to the test through my program, evaluate where opportunities, best practices, and challenges and gaps are, and then reinform the rest of the execution of that cycle across the nation on a repeating basis. Bob and I really met each other about a year ago when we, within the National Exercise Program, started really shaping our out-year goals for the next 2 years. And a big milestone event of that will take place in the late winter, early spring timeframe of 2020, known as the National Level Exercise 2020, a biennial event that we perform as a capstone to our 2-year preparedness cycle within the National Exercise Program. As we started shaping out what the objectives for that engagement was going to be, one of the key themes that kept popping up both within our own internal analyses as well as we reached out to our partners was this issue of cybersecurity. And where is the nation when it comes to both understanding of that threat, as well as where organizations, both those that live in the cybersecurity space day to day, but also those that are on the fringes, where are we in understanding the dynamics of that threat, what it means to our organizations, and then being able to respond to make our communities at all levels more resilient. And we started looking at the data, and we started seeing a lot of challenges. We produce, as part of our preparedness efforts, an annual report known as the National Preparedness Report. Cybersecurity for the last 5 years has ranked in the 5 lowest scored capabilities across the nation. And so that was a glaring issue for us that we wanted to leverage our priorities in our program to help influence. But as we did that, we also wanted to make sure that wherever this exercise known as NLE 2020 was going to be taking place, we also provided a true national benefit, not just a benefit to that municipality, that organization, that state that was going to be the primary locus of engagement. We wanted to benefit every one of our states and territories, our regions, and our partners throughout the community. And so that's where we really changed the idea about what an NLE is. We tried to look at it as not a 2-week exercise event that happens every 2 years, but a 2-year preparedness activity that culminates in a functional play event. And that's really where we saw the value of leveraging not only what Jack Voltaic has learned in its multiple engagements since the concept was just started, but what are we learning out of those engagements? I think one of the key things that we saw as we started working with the team was this idea of shared responsibility around cybersecurity, and that it's not just, again, those IT officers, those cybersecurity officers within organizations that really own these problems. That one, they play a pivotal role not only to helping ensure our system's resilience and protection, But those of us, even in the general emergency management sphere, other organizations have a key pivotal role to help shape the policy space, act on information that's coming out of those very technical niche areas, as well as help better prepare and guide our organizations going forward. And as we go forward with our investments in this leading up into 2020 and even beyond, we are working directly with the team to create and deliver a series of workshops across the nation that are helping to engage all communities in that dialogue, so that we as a nation walk away with a shared sense of improvement coming out of this engagement. Again, that'll help lead us up into that broader play. One of the other broader things that we're starting to see both within the emergency management space as well as within the infrastructure protection space is a maturation of the dialogue around what it means to identify organizations and their place in the structures. Even coming out of the large hurricanes in 2017, while that was not a cyber event by any stretch of the imagination, we learned a lot of critical lessons. We learned that we still identify organizations as who they are when it comes to large-scale incident response and responding to crises, not necessarily what they provide and who are they connected with to provide that critical service. And so as we're seeing the maturation in emergency management, we're evolving beyond a simplistic look at identifying and organizing ourselves around what's known as emergency support functions, if you're responsible or if you're familiar with the National Response Framework. We're moving into more of a lifelines, a community lifelines model that helps us identify what are those functions necessary to stabilize communities after a major event, and then how do we organize and function around partnerships, private, public, nonprofit, to be able to provide those critical stabilization services. As well as in the infrastructure space, we're seeing a similar dialogue. We're now not just talking about key sectors, and how do we organize ourselves around those sectors underneath federal and national plans. We're starting to see ourselves having a larger dialogue, even just released as early as the last 2 weeks, around these identification of these things known as critical functions. Again, looking at getting beyond, what are the organizations that we all wear across our name badges or on our shirts, but what does it look like then to function as a community and actually deliver those critical services? How are they delivered? What partnerships are necessary to deliver them then? And then how do we provide the right enablers to get to those results faster? And so that's kind of where we are right now in the spaces, and we're looking again at leveraging that even to this dialogue. What does it mean in the cybersecurity space to operate in those parameters? What if we have a major cybersecurity event? How do we work in the physical domain across those 7 community lifeline areas to stabilize those communities if we have a physical result that comes out of one of these cyber intrusion or cyber incident events? And that's how we're looking to push the system to help us make critical improvements back onto those areas that were identified as challenges in the National Preparedness Board.
Great. Thanks, Chad. Okay, now for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to go through some of the key findings, and then we'll open it up for questions. I just want to kind of have a conversation about each one of these. So one of the things that we talked about, Jack brought it up, everyone brought it up, was this idea, it was different, right? It was a bottoms-up approach. And so the challenge now is that it's an event, right? It gives you a point in time and assessment. How do you create a repeatable framework in this space, right? So let me start here, and just, Chris, if you can kind of spend 30 seconds, a minute or so, just kind of explaining some of the things that ACI is doing, but the broader Department of Defense is doing, the National Defense Authorization Act work and so forth. And Chad, if you can kind of talk about, how do we go beyond just an NLE 2020? Mm-hmm. And Jack, you've mentioned before, this was a catalyst to move further. How do we begin to drive this from an event, a point in time, into a strategy and a campaign?
People. You got to work it at the people level. You've got to know those contacts. You've got to understand what their role in this is, what your role is in it, and you work it from the bottom up. The executive order that came out last week, I think, gives us very good top cover on sharing. I don't know if you had a chance to read it or not, but it actually set the conditions so that I could go to work for FEMA, and FEMA's people could come and go to work for the Army Cyber Institute. Same with Jack and AECOM. How we're going to do that is I have no idea, but at least I've now got the mission set, or seen the mission set from the president down, saying we got to figure this out. It's not just going to be FEMA or me or AECOM or the problem fixed. have some more to say.
Yes, go ahead, Chad.
So I think that's a critical point, right? Is that we have to look at this as the beginning of a conversation. That's really how we're trying to shape the next 18 months from a national perspective. Is to set the conditions at the highest and the lowest levels of our structures to begin to provide the opportunity to have that engagement, whether it's an individual city-specific event like a Jack Voltaic event, and the communities and the structures and the organizations we bring to bear on that, whether it's at a state or a region level, or even, as we're walking into the Situation Room of the White House, and to engage in high-level policy discussions with the President's Cabinet. I think it really starts with the people aspect, right? We have to start getting ourselves into a level of comfort where we can have a discussion about these issues. And that's one of the critical challenges when it comes to cyber, is that it's this monolithic beast of a problem set that not everybody understands completely. It continues to evolve. It's in the front page of our newspapers every day, and we know it's a challenge, and we just don't know how we, at wherever we sit in the structure, can make an influence and a difference on that. I think the answer is it's not, none of us can do it alone. I think it has to be a coalition effort, but we have to set the conditions for that to happen. We have to get people into that level of comfort and familiarity where they understand the structures. They understand where they fit in the broader plan, where their plans even exist within their organization, is what they say their role is, and then who can they call for help when it exceeds their capacities. And I think that's really what the value is of workshops like Jack Voltaic, like an NLE workshop, whether it's a large exercise, small exercise, or even just a discussion. I think it's really getting folks understanding who the players are on the field, what resources are available, where they stand from an honest standpoint of a self-assessment, and then who's their cyber 911 when things start to go bad, and where they can expect support to come from and in what time frame. And then leveling that with an understanding of how can they continue to get smart and stay educated on this evolving threat, because it changes overnight. And making sure that we have the systems and resources where they need to be to sustain that system going forward. That's really where we see the system going after NLE 2020. That's going to be hopefully a very good event, and everything that we do to lead up to it. But it's got to continue after that. We don't want this to be a flash in the pan. And then I think that the larger national discussion: how do we sustain that then going forward, so that, again, that we can continue to build on that shared understanding.
Good. Jack, from local level, City of Houston?
Yeah, the one thing we looked at to do a repeatable model, to even bring this model into Houston, to bring it into the local level, the first thing you have to have is trust. I mean, because you got to think about it. You're bringing in a lot of outside elements into the local level, and they say, we want you to do this. So how do I get my stakeholders to the table? So it's like, oh, well, we understand tabletop exercises. Bring them to the tabletop. We do those all the time. They had no concept of the live fire exercise, the cyber virtual range. So that was a whole new concept. But we brought everybody to the table, which everybody said was people. We had to bring the people. But we also had to establish some type of trust. Because again, you have outsiders coming in, we want to do this to your city. We want this to happen, we want you to participate. So what is that trust? So you have to be open in that trust. We had to establish what are the objectives, but also what are your agendas? Because there's objectives and there's agendas. And I'm bringing in private sector partners that I have trust with, or they have trust with me, and I'm trying to bring that into these outsiders. And so we had to get up front, what are the objectives of this, but then also what are the agendas? What are you really after? And then you have to look at the agendas even in the stakeholders. What are they looking to gain out of this? What is their reason for coming to the table? And when we saw that in action. We also have to realize that we had to change our dynamic. When you talk about Harvey coming in, a physical threat coming in, a storm, a hurricane, you think about it, all the essential people are those that can build the city back up, the physical side, the emergency services, the rescuers, the infrastructure people. Very light on the cyber people, because they're not deemed essential, because cyber wasn't always looked at. The networks and stuff wasn't looked at. It was all physical. So the threat, the risk was you're vulnerable because your cyber people aren't at the table. Your cyber people aren't even in the room when there is a storm going on. There's maybe one or two people to kind of keep the networks working, but nobody's there protecting the infrastructure on the cyber side because they're all sheltering or out of town because they're non-essential. So we have to start changing that.
Yep.
When we bring in a hurricane, we need to bring in the IT professionals and a whole larger dynamic. But working the model, you're going to have people, you're going to have the trust, and you're going to have to establish, be plain clear, what are the objectives and what are the agendas? What are you trying to accomplish?
So what you're hearing, I think, is a few different things. One is a cultural change, right, that has to take place. As you've watched around the nation, when we've had cyber events and cyber people try to work through this, especially when there's physical disruption, whether it relates to emergency management services, public safety in general, it's not working very well. We've got to find ways to go beyond that. The other thing I think that you hear here is a discussion of shared objectives and shared interests. You've got to get that sorted early on and build a relationship over time. I will tell you, based as the private sector partner here, kind of pulling this together, actually working through the planning materials and building the scenario out, this was challenging in a couple of different dimensions. One is what we're really focused on is business continuity and government continuity at the same time. How do you, from a military standpoint, how do you achieve mission assurance and readiness, right? It's not just about, stand evaluating something at a point in time. And what we were trying to do in this event is to really get to that. Now, we do have some programmatic actions coming down the road. NLE is one of them. On the DoD side, we're now, we have something in the National Defense Authorization Act to look at modeling and simulation capabilities to help us think about ways we can scale this and to drive it further. Critical to working back and forth in this kind of government and private sector partnership is understanding the mission sets in national security. And what was expressly looked at here was the military support, of course, to a community, the Guard and others, but we also looked at, what is required outside the fence line to support military force projection in this case. And just up the road from Houston is Beaumont, right, where there is a large transload operation for force projection. Lots of lessons learned here as we think about the role of the military in both ways, right? So I'm going to turn back to Chris for a few thoughts in this space and where we are, what we learned, and then kind of get it from the civil and I'll provide some commercial perspective here on what's really happening. We have a long ways to go as we think about resilience and incident response in this space.
So we've talked about Jack Voltaic 1 and 2. Chad alluded to what we're calling 2.5, which is that traveling group going around the nation talking about Jack Voltaic and how to integrate it into an exercise you're doing. Bob's reference to force projection platforms, that's what we're going to call Jack Voltaic 3.0. Defender 2020 is going to happen next year, and that's basically, for some of you old-timers like myself, that's reforged or done over. We're looking at how to deploy forces to Europe, right? That's what the Army's doing. What we're going to do in addition to that is we're going to step off of that military base and we're going to look at the cities that are next to the military base that may be critical to force projection. We would love to be able to do some research on Charleston and Savannah, and we're in negotiation now with city managers there to actually see what their timeline is and how does it play. But it's going into that from a force projection standpoint. We think, okay, the military base is good. We got a lot of men and women looking at that. Who's looking at the city that's next to it, right? What's their vulnerabilities? What's their capabilities? What's FEMA's role? Where are they at on the priority list? And so 3.0 is going to start pulling that thread with, I think, 2 cities right now. It might go to 3, but it's going to be the same thing. Looking at that critical infrastructure out, what we call outside the wire or outside the military base.
Yeah. Thoughts, Chad?
So I think that's a critical point, is that as we look at this, and we've seen this in other mission sets as well, when you get outside of silos and stovepipes of coordination and really try to evolve the dialogue to a coalition type of an engagement, I think we have to look at it from a variety of standpoints. Is how do we start the conversation? what are the key topics, and then how do you sustain it going forward? And I think you have to look at each one of those independently. So from a standpoint of starting the conversation, I think everything we're talking about, whether it's DoD's objectives to provide force projection, whether we're trying to make communities themselves more resilient for a cyber threat or any other kinds of threats around there, or maybe there's some kind of a larger purpose of the infrastructure in these communities that helps provide a critical service across the nation as a whole. Any one of those are valid topics. And any organization, any community leader will stand forward and say, yeah, those are good topics, let's engage. But then you have to move it a little bit farther and figure out, what are those critical topics? And I think, Jack hit on it when he was talking about the engagements within that one specific delivery of Jack Voltaic is, what are the objectives? Where are we from organizations focusing our energies? What are the priorities? And are there synergies across organizational objectives that we can start identifying? And I think if we can get those slimmed down list of topics that we can agree across multiple organizations or multiple communities that are shared objectives, that provides the fodder then to move the discussion beyond individuals that are creating relationships to organizations that are creating relationships. And that's really how we want to sustain things. We want to build into organizations and to community level plans and governmental level plans. How do organizations function together? How are they making joint investments? How are they aligning operations? And maybe how are they backing each other up and partnering on critical areas where one or the other may fall short in capability and there's an opportunity to provide support? I think that's really how we see this going forward, and then what results out of that is a shared sense of higher level of resilience in those communities, so those communities can be protected. Critical services that they provide to other organizations like the military, like some other national security function, can be sustained. And then from a business side, they can sustain their business resiliency operation to make sure that they are still a viable entity going forward. And I think if we can get to that sense of the coordination, I think that's really what takes this, and it's something that could be sustained long term.
Jack, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, one thing we're looking at is how do we continue these efforts? And how do we continue these efforts locally? And you got to keep in mind, we had these powerful machines like AECOM, and we had Army coming down, literally the Army coming down, and we had FEMA coming down to help us move this great model. So how do we do it on the local level and keep doing this? And I don't want to lose that synergy. So what we're looking at is doing little mini Jack Voltaics using the same stakeholders that participated in the original one, bringing them back to the table every year and running through some type of objectives or scenarios. The thing what we're really focusing on and what this brought to light was, you look at all the trends that's going on in cyber warfare or just cyber attacks. You look at those trends and it's a storm. It's really like a storm. It's only a matter of time. It's going to hit your city. It's going to hit your facility. You can't stop it. You can't prevent it, but you can only plan for it and try to respond and recover from it. So our focus this year and the next year is going to be on cyber disruption and recovery. Because, if you think about when you're planning for a hurricane, it's just all about getting people out of the harm's way and then getting your city back up. It's the same thing on the cyber side. If you got a cyber storm, we need to start focusing on cyber response and recovery. We're also looking at the supply chain. Because if you start looking at all these organizations, we all depending on third-party services to function. So how resilient are they? Are they resilient? Are they going to be there when things are happening in your city? Or are they going to infect you with something because they were infected? So those are some other things we're looking at. So we're taking this model, scaling it back a little bit, and trying to sustain it and move it every year with these same stakeholders, and then grow it throughout our region, bringing in other stakeholders.
Great thoughts, great thoughts. I'm going to do one more round of questions. I'm going to go out to the audience, have one brief conversation. I want to talk about the role of industry, AECOM's role in this, the Greater Houston Partnership. I'd like to talk a little bit about academia and the important role academia plays here, and then at the state level. I sit on the governor's cybersecurity Education Economic Development Council, and the state had a key role in this particular experiment and exercise. So at the industry level, the Greater Houston Partnership was absolutely key. I think Jack would resonate with that comment. The GHP brought players and helped to facilitate and reinforce the relationships that Jack had already developed with the Verizons of the world, the CenterPoint Energies of the world, Coastal Water Authority, and the other critical infrastructure segments. And because of physical response activities, they had already developed a reasonably good working relationship that allowed us to build further on this. Ideas of mutual assistance across service territory lines as one concept, relationships between, a telco and an electric grid partner, those things were present. They needed to grow as we move forward in time. On the academic side, we had 3 universities involved: University of Houston, Texas A&M, and the University of Texas San Antonio. All of them had unique roles, but complementary roles as we kind of worked through this. The University of Houston was most active, not only in terms of providing support in the planning activities here, but also they had an operational role, which a lot of us weren't aware of, in terms of being able to use their PBS broadcasting station on campus and being able to use that to do data casting into police cars during emergency response. So learning about the capabilities of partners in different ways was another key aspect of this. Texas A&M was involved in supporting us initially with looking at concepts with ranges and emergency preparedness. And the University of Texas San Antonio actually coming away from this effort, worked with the state and is now running point on building an information sharing and analysis type organization across communities in the state of Texas. So the universities had a key role. One other element here was the role of the state, and we had, like in the city level and at the county level, we had lots of different players. At the state level, below the governor's office, you certainly had the state CIO engaged, you had the Texas Military Department engaged. Importantly, NIMKID and the emergency management response leads were engaged. All of them actually had not really worked together in an event like this, and so bringing state partners together with county and local community as well as the federal partners was important. What I'd like to do is just kind of go through one more conversation here about, as we worked through these partnerships, we found issues with programmatics and policies, playbooks, thoughts, folks, as we think about kind of the way ahead. What needs to change policy-wise? Jack brings up, hey, we've got the requirements, we don't have the money, right? We talked about throughout the exercise in this experiment, defense support to civil authorities. How does that work? How does that need to adjust? How do you get a rolling start on cyber activities? Physical response, you see the hurricane coming, you know it's coming, it's a week out, you're starting to get sandbags in place. How do we work through those kinds of issues? So again, let me turn to Jack first, then we'll go this way, and then we'll open it up for questions.
So there's a couple of points there. Now, I don't sit up at the DC level, so I don't know what's all going up there. I'm just down in the lower levels. But there was a couple of things that we saw that need to start happening. They need to happen quick. Is, when we were doing this physical event of a hurricane coming in and it was an actual cyber attack, well, then we were like, well, how are we going to involve the Army if it's a cyber attack, because that's going to go to the FBI, and then the FBI is going to start driving it, and it's not going to be a FEMA thing. So we were operating in that we were naive, that we didn't know it was a cyber attack, and we were asking the Army, hey, we got all these problems going on, can y'all come down and help, because they're already there helping with the sandbags and everything else. So we were just kind of like, oh, we don't know. So, but then it kind of opened up a thing, is like, when you're talking about recovering after an event, and you're trying to get your infrastructure back up, and you turn the switch on and it's not working and it's not damaged because it was attacked through the cyber network and shut down that way, and you are under a cyber attack and it turns into an FBI investigation, well, in a crime scene, you can't touch anything. So you're trying to recover your city. It's one thing when you have a damaged building, you rebuild it and you get going, but now you have a damaged component that's been in the event of a crime, is the FBI and FEMA having those conversations as to how long are we going to keep this down for the investigation and get it back up to get the city functioning? You know, are there going to be allowances, you know, those kind of things. So are those conversations happening? And I had that conversation with Randy Michelle. You know, I was like, y'all need to start talking to the FBI right now. Because the FBI is typically not in a hurricane role. But now they're brought into it in a cyber attack, and now we have a crime along with physical damage. They need to make sure they're talking.
Good, Chad.
So I think that's an essential point. So as we look at, you know, from the national level where our policies are, we've had, I think, the last major policy definition of how we approach this problem set overall put out in 2016 underneath the Presidential Policy Directive 41, as it's known, which kind of gives us the landscape for how do we look at these large-scale cybersecurity problems, and it really defines 3 lines of effort. One is absolutely the threat response piece. That's where the FBI plays that critical role up front from an investigative standpoint, and trying to understand the full extent of the problem. The second is asset response. How do we provide those technical supportive resources to organizations like the city or others that come out of DHS, as well as a couple other organizations that can deploy out in short notice to help owners and operators of systems get those systems back up online and have the issues potentially mitigated. And the third leg of that stool is intelligence support, looking at, you know, getting to a better sense of situational awareness, as well as, and, you know, better understanding of the threat overall, that particular incident, plus more of a global scale as well. And I think what we see from a policy standpoint, I don't know if we've identified right now authorities that may be more legislative in nature that are necessary. I think what we see is a better use of those structures that are being put in place. One, you know, awareness that they exist and the functions that they provide, and then what's necessary to enable those functions to go quickly into action. I think one of the things, back to the second leg of the stool, and maybe this ties a little bit into the investigative aspect that Jack brought up as well, is having the structures and permissions and agreements up front in blue sky days to enable the rapid provision of that support during those instances, whether it's, you know, as a secondary impact to an already crisis that's underway like Jack described, or it's purely a cyber-related event that's causing disruptions of city or other level networks that are impacting operations. But having even simple things in place like legal agreements with some of those assets at DHS to understand, you know, the provisions by which support to be provided, protections around information that's potentially handled in the conduct of those mitigative activities is essential, and that sometimes we see slows down the help being provided in the hours and days following an actual incident, and then slows down getting those assets back up online. And then I think on the third lane of things, I don't think we're seeing, we are not seeing at the national level an integration with even intelligence and information situational providers that kind of gets to one of the points that Bob brought up. We are, as a nation, at almost every level, even down to the city's level, very adept at understanding what it means for a large-scale hurricane or storm system to come into our areas, right? We trust the information providers, the meteorologists, and others that are assessing those threats. We know where our decision points are, even down to the hour from the potential onset of those storms to our communities. And we have that whole system locked and loaded to be able to execute, whether it's 72 hours out, 48 hours out. We know when we're evacuating people, where we're evacuating to, what it means, how do we mitigate the potential impacts. We have very little understanding of what it means to get advance notice in a threat environment, not the least of which is a cybersecurity threat. But I think we need to keep asking ourselves in our organizations and with our partners as we kind of organize around this is, what if? What if we had advance notice? What would we do? Who would we call to help us? How would we make sure we have protected our structures, you know, mitigated against these threats before they happen, or even as they're developing? Maybe they haven't spilled over into physical consequences yet, but maybe we see that over the horizon. And then how do we make sure that we can use this information to best drive those decisions? That's a critical area, I think, from a policy standpoint that we need to look at, and making sure even our organizations are mature enough and prepared to handle that potentially sensitive information, but then also drive it to those decisions. and kind of identifying what those decision points are. Are there trade-offs? Are there risks? And then how do we work together to mitigate those going forward? That's where we see some of the opportunities coming up.
Can I make a point real quick?
Sure.
Yeah. So you brought up a good point. We have to have those agreements in place, and that's one thing that our Fusion Center picked up on rather quickly is I need this intel, and we need to start sharing this information. So they immediately reached out to the State Guard and started having those conversations. How do we, and then, everybody's like, well, I don't know, we never had those kind of agreements before. We have agreement for this, but not for this. So now they're working through with the State Guard. We need your help now. We're going to need your help, period. We're going to need the Army, the state, whoever. We're going to need it. So let's get that agreement on the cyber side working, and that's what we've already started with on the intelligence sharing and getting those resources to come down if it does turn into a cyber event.
Chris, final thoughts?
Those two answers are because two researchers had a bunch of questions that they couldn't answer. They saw gaps and things that weren't being done. From that point to today at this panel is because that research, they said this research must be done. We must understand this space. I don't know how to give them any more kudos than that. The two things we're missing, and I will be so bold as to say, across this thing called cyber that we all struggle with defining, the two things we're missing, policies and laws to support us in the actions that we're going to need to take on the ground at some point in the future. Whether it's with our private partners or other departments and agencies or other services, we've got to understand those gaps and get those gaps filled so that we can make those agreements with each other to bring the right skill sets to bear at the right time. When FEMA asks, we know that the skill sets are there.
Good, thanks, Chris. So we got a few minutes left. Does anyone have any questions about what took place or how this applies to what you're doing today, other communities? Because we have gone ahead and are scaling this, as Chad indicated, with the NLE. We're also working, as Chris mentioned, in other communities through the Jack Voltaic 2.5 series, which takes us up and down the east and west coast. I think there's a critical role for trade associations, the Society of American Military Engineers, thinking about infrastructure and how infrastructure should be built, how we think through not only on the recovery side, but what we should be putting into infrastructure that's being connected more and more rapidly to support mission assurance, community resilience. So happy to take any questions. Okay, we have one in the back.
I have a comment. Oh, sorry, I have a comment. I'm with Electric Power Research Institute, and I don't know if we were engaged with you guys or not, but I just sent an email out saying that we need to be engaged. One of the things we do as well is we have a cybersecurity program for utility providers, electric utility providers across the United States. So we are engaging with your electric energy providers to create cybersecure all the way from the generation through transmission, distribution, that they control, right? Obviously, there's some things that they don't control, particularly like on a military installation. And so we have products and are engaging with those providers to help. And that's one of the things. I see a lot of focus on government support. There are agencies like EPRI, who's a nonprofit, almost a regulatory agency. We work very closely with DOE. That we are engaging at this level. In fact, if you guys don't know it, we just produced an EMP report for the National Grid. The next steps for that are generation. How do you how do you protect from EMP on the generation side? And potentially, I think there's some reports coming out or work being done on the distribution side, because we kind of stop at the substation at this point in our current reporting. So I just wanted to put that out there. So there are other industry folks engaging, and I'm going to try to make sure our guys get engaged with you guys in some form or fashion.
That's great. We had, as I mentioned, CenterPoint Energy, ERCOT was involved. We did, we're leveraging some best practices out of EEI with the cyber mutual assistance agreements. I've worked with EPRI before, fantastic organization. As we think ahead about just how far we can go with the electric industry, it's so critical as we think about growth of power and sustainability in different service territories and the interrelationships. My biggest concern CenterPoint Energy was great. Well, I'm concerned about the smaller co-ops that are around these military bases. And I know others are from the Army Corps and NAVFAC. As I look at the service level agreements, I'm just not sure they're where they need to be. So again, another lesson learned. Other thoughts? Oh, gosh, okay.
You talk about cyber attacks, but what about damage to, damage and overloading of the systems, and how to address those that would be caused by the natural disaster?
Okay. From the cyber perspective, I'll take it first, and then Jack, I can turn to you or Chad in this case. So one of the things we created in this scenario was a cascading event on the water treatment facilities, where we actually created a trip on a pumping station. It was done through a third-party vendor injection, where we basically overwhelmed the system. The challenge there is, one, is authenticating people into facilities. Secondly is really having backup plans, so that people understand the playbooks of what to do in Plan B, Plan C, and so forth. We didn't do anything. I mean, there were 4 waves of attacks within this Jack Voltaic series. So you imagine Harvey coming at you again. So you're anticipating wind and storm surge. At the same time, we ran ransomware attacks. We did a DDoS attack. We had this supply chain injection, which created a cascading effect. And then we ran a media disinformation operation, similar to what you would see a nation state do. When you threaded that all together, it was challenging. It was challenging for Houston. It was challenging for all of us. But I think that's reality. Right? We have a converged threat that we need to think about. And as we interconnect buildings, as we build new infrastructure, we're actually creating more attack space in cyber-enabled activities that we need to be conscious of and think through it. Not to say that we shouldn't interconnect things, we just need to think through what it means in terms of concepts of converged resilience. Other comments?
Well, you were talking about overloading, network overload and stuff. So I happen to be out of town at Harvey. So if I ever go out of town, just follow me, because I've been out of town for every major disaster except for Allison.
You're out of town right now.
I'm out of town right now, and we're having a problem right now. So they're trying to keep me from going out of town. But so I was out of town, but yet I was in direct communication with my network, because again, we rely on third-party services and outside services to get things done. And none of that failed, none of that went down. And because we were using other services, because we didn't have the infrastructure to maintain a lot of the things we do now. So that was telling me that even during Harvey, during that major of a storm, we never lost our communication, our cell communication. We never lost our network communication. And I think that's attributed to not because our infrastructure is so robust and resilient in the networks, it's because we're now offloading, if you will, some other services to the outside entities to keep it going. So that was a plus. We were able to do a lot of things remotely on the overloading
I
side.
think that's true, but on top of that, I do think since it was more of a flooding event as opposed to a high wind storm event, that also helped us a lot with our communications.
Absolutely.
So I think also you kind of trip on an issue that I mentioned earlier, this idea about we're evolving in the emergency management space more to a common language, lexicon, and coordination structure around these things called community lifelines. Beyond just our typing people by the organization that they have on their shirt, and or those specific places that they functionally align to. Because I think just to what you're getting to is because we found ourselves over the last several years challenged from really being able to, in the heat of an incident, doing causational analysis of why we were seeing the different effects that we were seeing, whether that's because we're seeing degradements in the health and medical capabilities of a community, or we're not seeing energy, either liquid petroleums or potentially even power getting to the communities that need them to be able to function. But as we dug into those issues over time, we found ourselves, it took a lot of time to get to the reason that the health and medical sector is red is not because of a lack of medical expertise. It's because the generators are running low at the hospitals, or the routes that are critical to get the patients to where they need to get that care are choked off. And so we really found ourselves with an energy and a transportation problem. And so I think being able to, whether it's because a physical impact to server locations, or because the systems weren't able to handle it, or from whatever hypothetical that we can potentially think of, being able to steer our processes and our plans towards more of that causational analysis so you can get to the what, now what, so what kind of a dialogue is really essential. So we're ready for the next physical event, or if we had to handle something as challenging as cyber, our structures are nimble enough to be able to do that.
Okay, well, we've run out of time, so I want to thank everyone. I know there were lots of hands raised at the end here. We'd be happy to take questions up here afterwards, but I want to thank all the panelists for all their help and the great conversation. And I want to thank all of you as well. Take care.